Yeah, so there was at least four different military putsches, or some even call them, coup attempts.
Four?
There, yeah, in
This is not a good sign.
in 2019,
Okay. Wait, I'm
January.
sorry, four in 2019?
Yeah, yes.
I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. Hello. Yes, that's correct. It's me. And that means you're listening to another episode of Always at War. Why? Because we're always at war, honey. We are a podcast brought to you by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank dedicated to building a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. I'm one of your hosts, Courtney Rawlings, here as always with Alex Jordan. Alex Jordan, how you doing?
I'm living. I'm all right.
I got to tell you right away, based on tone of voice alone, sounds like you're lying to me.
I am lying to you. I'm not. This has been an upsetting week. You may or may not know about.
Busy.
Yeah, you may or may not know about the holidays, which happen towards the end of the year. There's the Hanukkah holiday. There's Christmas. There's New Year's. There's Kwanzaa. All those holidays.
Classics.
We were going to take a break over the holidays, and we did for a while there.
Yeah, we got like a solid 8 days in.
Yeah. And then Trump decided to kidnap the leader of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro.
Interesting. Hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, this is new news for you. But it
I'm sure no one listening has heard about it.
No one's listening has heard about it either. But
we're like a week and a half late. That's okay.
It's no biggie. I mean, yeah, we had to get an episode going on this because it is like it's such a definitional, picture perfect example of what we have spent the last however many episodes talking about U.S. aggression, U.S. regime change efforts in Latin America, the history of America abrogating to itself the ability to change other governments' leadership at will. It's got it all,
wanton
baby.
Violence for absolute without cause.
U.S. foreign policy, hypothetically, about keeping Americans safe. Kidnapping Nicolás Maduro, bombing the shit out of Venezuela, just so we can strike a better, more preferential oil deal with them is not exactly related to what's best for the American people.
No, I feel safer already.
Yeah. You were next up. You were the Venezuelan regime's number one.
They were also going to give me the Nobel Peace Prize, but unfortunately got sidelined.
Next time,
because I was second runner up.
Next time,
yeah, we'll see.
Are we going to be the first podcast to win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Probably. I don't see why not.
We are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about.
Yeah, so that did happen. I have a lot of questions about it. I feel like I've been reading the headlines. I've been diving deep into, unfortunately, the New York Times op-ed pages to try and understand. Not to try and understand, just to see where the establishment is, and walking away more confused than ever. So I am really excited to talk to Lee.
Yeah, we're so excited to have on the show Lee Schlenker. Lee is a research associate with the Global South program at the Quincy Institute. Lee had previously served as the policy director at an advocacy organization working to improve U.S.-Cuba relations. He is also an MA candidate in Latin American Studies at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Lee, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. I guess we'll just jump right in. How did you become interested in Central South American politics, foreign policy? Could you give us a quick kind of where Lee stands?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on the show. As you know, I've been working on Latin America issues at QI over the past year, and before then, I had begun a master's program in Latin American Studies at Georgetown University, School of Foreign Service. But a lot of that stemmed from my interest in U.S. foreign policy towards the region more broadly. After having lived and worked in Cuba for about 4 years, I'd worked with a number of journalistic outlets as well as nonprofit organizations that had a presence on the island, mostly during the Obama era detente or rapprochement with Cuba that began really in 2014. And so there was sort of a big boom in U.S.-Cuba relations, in diplomatic contacts, in people-to-people ties. And I was sort of right at the center of that through the work that I was doing with a couple different organizations. And so that really helped stimulate a lot of my interest in U.S. Latin America politics, sort of diplomacy, and the role of sort of peace organizations, just everyday citizens in sort of improving just diplomacy and relations with countries with whom the United States has not had great relations historically.
I want to go back and ask about Cuba because I think there's a lot of relevant ways to talk about Cuba as sort of a case study for how the U.S. and particularly Washington thinks about Latin American politics. But let's talk about the acute news incident that has gathered us here today, which is Trump invading Venezuela, launching these airstrikes, kidnapping Maduro, bringing him back to the States to face trial. What was first off, I guess, your reaction to seeing Trump actually take this action? Was it a surprise to you? And in the days since, we're recording this on Friday the 9th, it'll be out early next week. What have you made of, or have you been able to make sense of what the Trump administration's strategy or hope for what happens next is?
Yes, that's a great question. It's been sort of difficult to parse out a clear through line and end goal for the Trump administration's drastic sort of escalation in its relations to Venezuela, including through this raid last Saturday. It seems that the Trump administration has settled on sort of this convergence of drugs, of trying to stem migration, supposedly of, issuing these foreign terrorist organization designations of groups operating out of Venezuela, which they claim Maduro and some of his closest associates are running, which contradicts the United States' own intelligence agency assessments. And also this broader sort of set of aspirations for increased hegemony and dominance throughout Latin America, and access to its strategic resources and critical minerals, which Venezuela has a plethora of, notably oil, but also coltan, gold, and other rare minerals that are used for defense production. So there's been a number of sort of different interests, and it's almost been like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, to not try to alienate some of Trump's base, really in the MAGA movement, which has been very skeptical and critical, rightfully so, of sort of interventionism and regime change tactics that the United States has pursued in the past in places like the Middle East, but also in Latin America. There's a really disastrous history of U.S. engineered regime change efforts to unseat democratically and non-democratically elected governments. And so we're seeing this all crystallize in this really illegal and I would argue unnecessary raid that killed at least 80 people, including Venezuelan civilians and military personnel, as well as Cuban military and security forces. This really, I would claim is unnecessary because of the diplomacy that had been taking place throughout the entire year. We hear Marco Rubio saying that there were multiple offers made to Maduro to go into exile, whether that be in Turkey, in Qatar, in Russia, in other places, and that would smooth the path for a deal. But really what we're seeing now is this sort of regime management or regime coercion, or some people have said Trump is hacked regime change, where basically you have
not hacked.
Madurismo without Maduro. It's everything is basically still in in place. Like the entire structure of the government is still in place. They still have control over the state apparatus, over the country's military and security forces. The opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, has been completely sidelined in this operation, even as Trump has said that he would meet with her next week, reportedly in Washington. But basically, there's been a broader accommodation with the remaining Chavista leadership. And we can get into this later, but I would argue that this is a major blow, actually, to hawks and neocons like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and actually somewhat of a victory of a figure in the Trump administration, Rick Grinnell, who I've been reporting about since, at least the beginning of this administration, and his tensions with Rubio, about trying to engage and realistically work with the government administration regime in Caracas, however you want to call it, as is, as opposed to these broader illusions that Rubio and his base of support in South Florida and the allied lawmakers in Miami have had all along, that we can just easily install this opposition figure whose uncompromising and maximalist positions has really, sidelined her. And I think Trump has sort of understood, and his top intelligence and security advisors have understood, that she is not going to be able to secure any sort of U.S. interests, let alone for, his oil exec friends that want to just get in and start making money. So,
and just really quick, is that because she's not popular in the country? Because she's so popular in the United States for whatever reason, and clearly in the elite class worldwide, does she not have that kind of popular support on the ground?
So she does. I mean, it would be false to say that she doesn't have any sort of broad support. I mean, the elections in July 2024 were clearly contested. Maduro didn't show the actas or the tally sheets at any sort of detailed level showing that he had won as claimed. So most independent observers agree that at least somewhere between 60 and 70% of the vote did go to Edmundo Gonzalez, the retired diplomat that sort of served in place of Maria Corina Machado as she was disqualified by Maduro's administration from running. So she does have some popularity.
That's pretty popular. I mean, that's like a real whirlwind win. If we think that that's what happened. So I'm a little confused why Trump would give up installing, someone who was quite a toady for him for a long, long time.
Did you at any point offer to give him the Nobel Peace Prize? Did that actually happen? I had read that somewhere. I wasn't sure if it was true.
Well, it hasn't happened yet, but I certainly would love to be able to personally tell him that we believe the Venezuelan people, because this is a prize of the Venezuelan people, certainly want to give it to him and share it with them.
I saw her constantly on TV, just like being asked about her Nobel Prize, but only really talking about Trump. How do we square that circle?
Yeah, I think it kind of shows that Trump is more interested in sort of the short-term material interests that could come from an economic windfall of, recovery of the oil industry in Venezuela. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion from oil industry executives and energy analysts about how this is a long-term sort of proposition to be able to, to restore the industry. It would take hundreds of billions of dollars. It would be at least 5 years, if not more, to at least double out. I mean, there's been years of sanctions, as well as sort of domestic mismanagement. There's been corruption. There's just been a general decay of the oil infrastructure, as well as concessions that have been made and granted to, companies from Russia, from China, but also, the major U.S. oil company Chevron, which had been granted licenses by the Biden administration, and there was an ongoing feud within the Trump administration between Rubio and Grinnell, as I had mentioned, about the continuity of those oil licenses. Ultimately, they were allowed to continue under pretty restrictive terms, but so. It's a complicated situation in terms of how to actually revive this industry, because there's not really much security, in terms of like foreign investment, in terms of like, private property, respect for the security situation is unstable. Things could change, based off what Trump tweets that day. I mean, the situation is very volatile, and that's hard for investors to really have sort of much confidence in that scenario.
I want to, forgive the play on words, like drill down on this a little more. We mentioned this meeting today with oil executives and potentially, it sounds like, representatives from the Venezuelan government. I'm thinking about a tweet this week from friend of the pod, Michael McFaul, after Trump's initial press conference about like why he decided to capture Maduro. McFaul was like, it was preposterous. Trump didn't mention democracy once, because, like so often when Washington talks about regime change, it talks about it in a conversation about freedom and democracy and allowing people to have a say in their own government. Is part of the way to sort of interpret the Trump regime making peace with keeping, almost all of the Maduro government minus Maduro. Is that because it is easier for them to strike a sort of like formalized extractive agreement regarding what happens with Venezuelan oil with somebody who's already in power, already has the legitimacy of the Maduro government, versus, quote unquote, like democratizing the country, allowing free and fair elections, and then somebody like Machado has to actually like win democratic popular support for sending some portion of oil revenues to the US. Like, it's probably easier to get that agreement with people who are already in power than let the Venezuelan people decide, and then the person who gets elected has to actually spend political capital on, hey, yeah, the Venezuelan oil is actually American oil.
Yeah, I think that's right, Alex. I mean, Maria Corina Machado was successful in mobilizing millions of people across the country to support a political campaign, but that doesn't necessarily translate into being able to quickly control the vast state bureaucracy and apparatus, take control of the national oil company, PDVSA, enter into actually governance agreements with the Chavista leadership that has led the country for 25 years, and to actually instill confidence that they can maintain order on the ground, that they can establish a monopoly on the use of force in the country, and that they can actually govern successfully in the short term. And so I think this is sort of a more brute political calculation backed up by the Trump administration's own intelligence assessments that basically the status quo is going to be more profitable and easier to coerce.
It is literally a new frontier. It is one of many new frontiers unfolding today in our sister republics to the south. Frontiers springing from the same needs, the same hopes, the same aspirations which once beckoned pioneers to our own far west.
No, I don't want to underestimate the ability of somebody like Marco Rubio to continue to wield his power and his influence and try to get his way, to basically install Machado into power. I mean, he's been a huge supporter, and the politicians in South Florida that have been sort of his main allies and supportive of his approach, his sort of maximalist, not 1 cent for the regime, no concessions, like no dialogue, like that faction still is able to sort of, I would say, wield pressure over the Trump camp and to make their perspectives known. I mean, even yesterday, there was a massive release of political prisoners, some of the biggest names in the country, some even progressive or, center left, center right forces. And that was because of this sort of credible threat of using the U.S. military to basically go back in and to impose the Trump administration, I would say in this case, Rubio's will, if the Venezuelan, government that's in power now didn't accede to those demands. And so And the same thing with elections. I mean, Rubio has said there's a 3-phase plan. The first will be stabilization of the conditions on the ground, then recovery, and then this third phase in which there will be amnesties and prisoner releases and free and fair elections. And I think he's going to continue to push for that, because he's going to have to manage a lot of pressure from his base in South Florida, who thought that this would be an operation that would install Machado into power. And I think what we're seeing from Trump and from people like Rick Grinnell and, oil executive and Trump friend Harry Sargent, who's done business with Mesa and in Caracas for years, is that they would prefer somebody like Delcy Rodriguez, because basically it would allow them to just kind of rebuild the industry as quick as possible, to just have the most stable governing coalition, and concerns about democracy or human rights or political pluralism can be sort of pushed off from.
And excuse me, can you explain who that is really quick?
Harry Sargent. So he's a Palm Beach based business magnate and oil executive. He's had asphalt business in Venezuela for years because of the heavy crude that can be extracted there. It can easily be turned into asphalt. So he's been able to maneuver a number of licenses from the Treasury Department to be able to legally operate in Venezuela, even amid the broader sanctions regime. And he, as well as others, I mentioned sort of Rick Grinnell and sort of other people close to or inside the administration, have really been pushing for sort of a broader detente and normalization without any sort of broader political concessions or trade-offs throughout the entire administration. And the goal has been really to just sort of look out for the interests of these companies, but also to help recover sort of the Venezuelan economy. And we have to remember that there have been maximum pressure sanctions that economists such as Francisco Rodriguez have found have played a major role in pushing Venezuelans out of the country because of the broader economic decline and collapse over the past years. I mean, 8 million Venezuelans, we have to remember, have left the country, almost 1 million of them to the United States, the most of them to other countries in Latin America, which has really overwhelmed a lot of the sort of public and social services in those countries. And so a lot of that has been to government policies around exchange rates and sort of about sort of import-export policies regarding the private sector. But much of that has also been because of U.S. sanctions that have constrained the ability of the government to sort of capitalize on its major mineral resources and wealth. And that's when 90% of the country's economy is dependent on oil.
It is chiefly Maracaibo that enables Venezuela to rank next to the United States and Russia in petroleum production. Some of the best wells tap the lake bottom with derricks right out over the water. And we see one of Maracaibo's famous sunsets.
If you basically prevent the country from selling that oil to its historically largest market, the United States, with very minor exceptions, when you sanction basically the financial industry in which bondholders are not able to trade in Venezuelan bonds, when the central bank's assets abroad are frozen out, when billions of dollars of the country's assets are handed over to a parallel government that the first Trump administration recognized and then kind of left by the wayside, that has a huge economic impact on the country in every way. And many have said that this would, if there's these seized oil tankers as well. I think the 5th one was seized today.
Right.
If that sort of de facto oil blockade continues, it could lead to famine. I mean, it could lead to sort of mass destabilization.
Well, Lee, I don't know if you've heard, but back in 2016, I was told by InfoWars, was this 2016 or was it 2020? I think it was 2016. I was told by InfoWars that Venezuelans were in fact eating rats, and it had little to do with U.S. sanctions. In fact, those were never mentioned, and it had a lot to do with Maduro's human rights abuses, the murderous kind of poison of socialism.
Well, you know Venezuela, right? Heard of it. A majority of the country is currently eating rats, while their politicians are drinking champagne on a daily basis.
And yet, that isn't really part of the broader story the Trump administration is telling. Can you explain to me what's really going on the ground in Venezuela? Is this an ideological war partially, or is it an oil war, or is it some third thing? I know you can't really quite answer that exactly, but I'm just a little confused because it's the first time ever hearing that story.
I think it depends on who you ask within the Trump administration. I think for somebody like Marco Rubio, this is clearly ideological. I mean, he sees Venezuela as the chief sort of central node of a broader sort of socialist axis in Latin America that reaches its tentacles out to Cuba, to Nicaragua, even to Colombia under President Petro, and some have even sort of gone as far to say to Mexico and Brazil under both Sheinbaum and Lula. I mean, there's a lot of this discourse that we hear among Venezuelan American exile voices here in the United States, who are broadly supportive of the Secretary of State and his approach towards sort of weeding out 21st century socialism in Latin America. So for him, coming from South Florida, having made his way up through the Florida state legislature, through the United States Senate, and having a very close relationship with many of the Venezuelan and Cuban American exile organizations, many of whom, and this is another story, have received millions of dollars in U.S. taxpayer funds to carry out their efforts both in the country and in domestic lobbying here in the United States.
This is this has a lot of tentacles, Lee.
It's a broad ecosystem, and Rubio has historically benefited and been very supportive of it, right? And that's a whole other conversation about the dismantling of foreign aid and the carve-outs that have been made for some of these exile organizations. But we can get to that in another episode. The important thing is that Rubio is, for him, it's deeply ideological. And
I think we might need 15 episodes at this point. I have so many questions.
He's been forced to sort of to take up some of these other discursive or rhetorical pretexts, such as narco-terrorism, or that this was just a law enforcement only operation, or that repeating some of Trump's just gross fabrications about Maduro emptying up his mental institutions or jails and just allowing drug dealers to come into the country. I mean, Rubio has really taken up the mantle of these sort of rhetorical devices because he knows that they'll be popular in other factions of the MAGA base that aren't just in South Florida, who are purely ideological and anti-communist in their sort of their search to oust Maduro, right? So you have if you ask somebody like Stephen Miller, the Homeland Security advisor, a lot of the analysis that I've seen, which I tend to agree with, is that in the broader push to deport hundreds of thousands of immigrants from the country, and given all of the legal backlash they've received in the courts for doing so, they need a plausible justification to show that the United States is actually at war with Venezuela, right? To invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, right? So if you can stir up war with Venezuela, if you can strike narco boats, if you can amass sort of a fleet of U.S. naval power off the coast of the country, if you can claim that the president, whether legitimate or not, of the country leads a fictitious cartel, the Cartel of the Suns, or even the Tren de Aragua, which is notorious for not being involved in sort of massive
notorious for not being involved is not a sentence I hear today.
Well, in the DOJ, this
not involved in massive narcotics trafficking in the United States. I mean, then you're setting up the sort of set of pretexts needed to say that you are at war with Venezuela, and then you can deport all these people who had been granted temporary protected status. So I think if you ask different people, then there's different reasons, different pretexts, and they've all seemed to have converged. and been able to convince Trump, who I think, as we get towards the midterms, and we can discuss this sooner, will lose focus, will lose interest, and I think is basically directed, people like Grinnell, who have actually been able to deliver on Trump's objectives and has grown frustrated with Rubio, who has not actually been able to deliver him the oil he wanted. He sold him this false illusion that they could install the opposition. And now Rubio is doing damage control and trying to sell this through his consolation prize of, we got Maduro, or, maybe we can use the gunboat diplomacy and the coercion over Delcy Rodriguez to sort of extract Cuba from the country. Maybe, we'll have this illusion that we're going to be able to call free and fair elections sometime in the future. It seems like Rubio is going to be the only person in administration who's actually going to be pushing for that, right? I think they're going to start sort of losing interest and moving on to the next issue, and Rubio is going to be sidelined, but we'll see.
Well, I feel like you guys are getting at something that I think is important. And so, I feel like it's a mistake that the media makes, which is really trying to think of U.S. interventions as monocausal. And more likely, we have this very big machine that is hard to move. It's easiest to move if you're the president, but there tend to be multiple actors. And this is the case in the Iraq War. You had true believers, you had cynics, and you had political opportunists. And I think that that's often the case when it comes to why the U.S. wages war, is that it could have material interest, it can have ideological interest, that these things can all happen at once. And in Trump's team, you have all of these competing factions sitting beneath the president, who is notorious for not necessarily being a consistent policy maker. So it seems like a pretty toxic brew for launching something like a very consequential intervention and then setting out all these phases for how we're going to change the country, and it's going to reach all these agreements, and it's going to be a fundamentally different relationship. And then does the administration have the focus and the follow through to actually get all these things that it says that it wants, that it expects from this intervention? I think we were all very skeptical.
I think this idea of not wanting to have boots on the ground and not do nation building has seemingly convinced Trump. I think the folly is that this will be sort of just a quick intervention, surgical strike. We've taken Maduro out, and now, there's going to be some broader transition. I mean, that's not what's happening out in real time. What we're actually seeing, there's been sort of an accommodation with the regime, which I think goes to the point that the strike against Maduro, the extraction, the abduction, the kidnapping, whatever you want to call it, not only was it illegal, and not only sets a terrible precedent for the region, but it was unnecessary, because you had people in the administration who were engaged in very complex diplomacy with multiple nations, with the Vatican. There was a great report that shed some insight from the Washington Post just today, that were engaged in these sort of complex negotiations. Now, you could take Marco Rubio's line, and say, well, Maduro wasn't serious about them. He just, was playing around and didn't actually want to strike a deal. He was just buying time. Okay, but I mean, what we're seeing now is that diplomacy and engagement actually is yielding results. I mean, Trump is getting the oil for his buddies that he's wanted. I mean, the prisoners have been slowly released, which is what Rubio and that faction has always wanted. And, it seems like there will be a resetting of diplomatic relations. Just today, there was State Department officials that have traveled to Caracas. It's been reported that even though Delcy Rodriguez is still under U.S. sanctions, that she might have a meeting with Trump in D.C. next week. So a lot of the maximum pressure sanctions that Trump had imposed in his first administration seem like they're going to be lifted. I mean, at least the devil's in the details, but he had a post saying that, Venezuela has agreed to basically buy all U.S. made products, food, medicine, electrical grid inputs, which, say what you want, but at the this is like a slow lifting of the blockade without a major regime change. It's sort of like this regime transformations. And I'm not saying, this is good or bad, but I think basically what we saw last Saturday was unnecessary, that you didn't have to go use the U.S. military to abduct a foreign leader and break all sorts of international norms and conventions and set a terrible precedent for the region to basically get to where we are today, where there's just a broader reaccommodation. And yeah, you could make the argument that like, oh, the credible use of force is what was sort of the turning point because they weren't taking our threats seriously. But I think diplomacy is proving in real time and engagement that it does work, that you can, secure U.S. interests, that's what Trump wants, geopolitical, energy, migratory, whatever, and also not have to have some sort of like really costly regime change, boots on the ground, messy transition. So obviously it's terrible that there's, this threat over the Venezuelan authorities' head that basically will take you out next if you don't follow what we do. But I think the more important point is that this whole operation, this raid, was not necessary to get to the broader regime accommodation that we're seeing today.
I guess I don't mean to be cynical, but like, I hear what you're saying. Like, I agree. This is absurd, by the way. Like, I'm not about to disagree with you, but and I know that there's a lot of people in power who have a lot of different interests, but it's very difficult for me to look at, say, Trump's own words on Truth Social and not walk away saying, like, pretty much all he cared were drugs. Turns out that was a fabrication, and oil. And he wants to use a gun to get oil. Is that going to work? Is it working?
Yeah, I think the drugs were definitely a fabrication. I mean, we know that Venezuela does not produce fentanyl, even if J.D. Vance is going to dig his heels in and try to convince,
really would advise against that, by the way, J.D. We can all use Google.
That was not a good look because, I mean, even the U.S.'s own drug threat assessment, like from 2025, made very clear that Venezuela is not producing, or there's no transit of fentanyl, and even the amount of cocaine is very limited, around 10%, that comes from Colombia and goes through Venezuela, and much of it ends up in Europe and is not actually going directly to the United States, but rather to other Caribbean countries. So that was clearly a pretext. Now with oil, it all comes down to sort of like what share of the profits U.S. companies are going to get. Because as we said, under the Biden administration, even under this administration, there was still a deal with Chevron, right? Chevron stayed in the country after the oil renegotiations of 2007 with Hugo Chavez. Exxon didn't like the terms. They wanted a bigger share of the profit. ConocoPhillips didn't like the terms. They wanted a bigger share of the profit. And they got out, and they have been, seeking compensation, and they've been undergoing arbitration at these international courts. And so Chevron has stayed, right? When Trump initiated these maximum pressure sanctions in 2019, it was basically betting on this strategy of like, we're going to make the country collapse. We're going to make the economy scream, and no, not 1 cent for the dictatorship. And that's going to be the downfall. And it didn't happen. Right. And so under Biden,
but the downfall of the Maduro regime because they're not sharing profits, like, is that what, like, obviously, sure, there might be ideological reasons, but I just want to focus on the oil for 1 second.
Yeah.
So was at least part of the goal to take down Maduro in order to get Chevron and Conoco, I totally know that other company, more of a share of this profits? And then really quickly, why do they get a share of those profits?
Well, these are joint ventures, right? So these are agreements that PDVSA, the nationalized state oil company from back in 1976, even before Chavez's Bolivarian revolution, was initiated in the late 90s after he won the election in 1998. So these are cooperative agreements where they share in the profits because they also share in producing and investing, putting the capital down to produce this oil in the first place, right? This is a very common.
So they're like, here, we're going to help you do this, right? Like we have the know-how and the materials,
and the investment.
We help you extract,
we have
and
the
then
money.
Got it.
Yeah, exactly, and we get part of the profit, and then you get. I mean, how historically it had functioned before the renegotiations, where Chavez basically said, we want a bigger share of the oil wealth to remain in the country, which was then reinvested for housing, for social services. I mean, there was verifiable data, right, that the poverty indicators, inequality indicators, sort of social mobility, access to education, to housing, to healthcare had notably risen during the commodity export boom, as it was known, of sort of the mid to late 2000s, because oil prices were so high, right? And so Chavez was trying to take sort of advantage of those high oil prices to say, well, why are these foreign oil companies who, have basically exploited our natural wealth, even though they're also partners for a century, have taken such a big share of the profits when, we still have people in the country who are malnourished, who are sort of, don't have access to these basic life necessities. So that was the logic, right? And clearly it was popular for Chavez at the time, but then when oil prices, dropped, and then Hugo Chavez died and Maduro, became the president in 2013, this is when a lot of the crisis began, right? Because they didn't have that economic windfall. A lot of foreign investment had pulled out because they didn't like the new terms. So to get to your question about like the share of the profits now, right? Like Chevron has basically throughout the Trump administration stayed in the country. They think that they're like a stabilizing force for the local economy. Like Venezuela wants the Maduro regime wants them there, right? Because they were like producing about a third of the country's oil exports. And it was good for the Trump administration too, because they want to like box China and Russia out from Latin America. So they're basically saying like, it should be sent to the refineries in the Gulf Coast and supporting jobs in Louisiana and Texas, as opposed to going to China. So it was sort of like,
this sounds like freedom to me, brother. I'm a little confused.
So it was like pretty good, And then basically the point of like the first term in the Trump administration was that like they recognized this parallel government of Juan Guaido, right? As people say, the self-anointed or the interim president of Juan Guaido. And the thought was that by installing him and his sort of team, that there would be even better terms and better conditions where there'd be either a partial or a wholesale denationalization of the oil industry, so that companies like ConocoPhillips, like Exxon, would basically get back what they lost. They would
Which is like almost all of it then. Wouldn't like if you denationalize, then it's pure profit.
Right.
Cool.
And this is what we've been seeing from Maria Machado this whole year in all these forums, investment and energy forums in Miami and Houston. Like, this is $1 trillion investment.
This country, Venezuela, is going to be the brightest opportunity for investment of American companies, of good people that are going to make a lot of money.
You can, if you like support regime change, then you're bound to make $1 trillion in all of these industries, from gas to
I
oil.
feel like I'm finally seeing everything more clearly. This is what my intuitions were telling me. And so that's why I just wanted to really quick focus on the oil of it all. So thank you.
Wait, I'm going to pause real quick. What do we understand? Do we have a better understanding now than we did in like 2019 of that like really Bay of Pigs thing where they like there were like people affiliated with the U.S. who were maybe going to try a regime change and then it all fell apart? Could you walk our listeners through like what happened, that this isn't exactly the first time the U.S. tried to covertly change the political situation in Venezuela?
Yeah, so there was at least 4 different military putsches, or some even call them, coup attempts.
4?
Yeah.
This is not a good sign.
In 2019, January.
Wait, I'm sorry, 4 in 2019?
Yeah. So in January.
I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly.
In February, along the border with Colombia from Cucuta, where they tried to ram humanitarian aid in, and even the Inspector General of USAID found basically a lot of irregularities, and that this was not just sort of like a depoliticized attempt to get aid into the country, but actually as like a Trojan horse to destabilize and to promote regime change. And then in April, again, there was a failed military uprising egged on by Guaido. And again, it's hard to have any sort of conclusive evidence that the Trump administration or like currently serving, or officials that were serving at that moment, were like directly involved. But there's a lot of sort of
circumstantial
reporting and circumstantial sort of evidence showing that there was conversation, there was sort of cooperation or collusion with certain officials, and like the more well-known figure, this guy Jordan Goudreau, who was a former Green Beret, had a company, Silvercore, who had tried to invade the country through a base in Colombia. This is a very different political context in which Colombia had a more right-wing government of Ivan Duque that was willing to lend its territory, reportedly to allow for these sorts of maneuvers to enter into Venezuelan territory, to destabilize the country and to, eventually form a beachhead to allow for some sort of transition government to be installed. So yeah, the U.S. doesn't have a great history with
What?
Venezuela. And also, you go back to 2002 as well. There's been declassified documents that the CIA was well aware of a short-lived, I believe it was 3-day military coup against Chavez at that moment. And really what I think the United States is recognizing now is what was apparent back then, 24 years ago at this point, is that the coup government, the opposition figure led by Pedro Carmona at the time, was not able to actually effectively lead or govern or stabilize the situation in the country. And thus they sort of let that attempt fizzle out. And Chavez was returned by his own, his top military brass a few days later. Right. So I think sort of the U.S. is finally learning maybe the hard lessons that installing a pliant government from abroad.
Let me stop you there, Lee. They're not learning any lessons.
Not gonna.
Well, I don't think the U.S. has learned a lesson a day in its life.
Well, so what you're telling us is a story of particularly recently, by hook or by crook, the U.S. government was determined to at least, there were segments of the U.S. government who were talking about democracy, talking about human rights concerns, but there's also a segment of the U.S. government who saw it in the U.S. interest to, however they could, change the arrangement vis-a-vis oil. And they may have tried first with sanctions to bring them to the table. They may have tried with covert regime change, and then they're trying with overt regime change now. And it's
actually funny to do it overtly because it's already didn't work day one. There is no new regime, and I don't think that they were even thinking about it. That's just it's so kooky, it's so crazy. I feel like I'm watching a cartoon that only hurts the American people. This broad idea of taking over Venezuela for whatever reason, and installing a new government, is purely in the interest of elites and has nothing to do with us news-watching Americans. It is just gonna cost us money. The promise being okay, the Exxon, CEOs are going to let this trickle down to us. I mean, it's psychotic. And so then they try and tell us this drug story. They try and tell us this story about human rights abuses, which may or may not be true. Or I think are largely there's issues with the Maduro government, but also largely caused by the U.S. government in the first place vis-a-vis sanctions. I mean, it's mind-numbing because I feel like I'm reading headlines written by aliens. I'm being force-fed a narrative that doesn't make sense at all. And then, but even when you tell me that the most cynical take that this is an oil war, that, whatever, even that doesn't make sense. Because it only makes sense for 6 people in the world. And I don't know. That was my rant. I'm just very grumpy.
And I think it's going to backfire. I mean, there's already been a lot of reporting that Republicans are reaching out to the White House saying that they're not happy, that there's just all this excess attention being put on foreign policy, but on Venezuela particularly, that it might hurt them in the midterms, where there's already, wide predictions that the Democrats will take back the House. And there's been a lot of polling, surprisingly, even in Miami, right, which has supposedly been celebrating. There's been all these puff pieces about this restaurant in Miami in Doral, which is a big Venezuelan area called El Arepaso, the arepa, palace, basically, where they're all celebrating. And that's great. And everyone's happy that Maduro's gone. But there's also been a lot of really interesting reporting that they're deeply nervous and disappointed and feel sidelined and betrayed because they're weren't you supposed to install Our Lady Machado into power? And that just now seems like a pipe dream. She's not, I mean, maybe she's going to meet with Trump next week, but they're not even happy. There was polling.
I don't know if there's going to be room in his dance house. What is it called? He said it was so full. His ballroom, his dance house.
I like that.
I didn't sleep last night.
There's polling that even Miami-Dade voters didn't want any sort of like military intervention to remove Maduro, let alone the American people. I mean, there's been a ton of polling that like 70% of Americans, I think CBS found a few months ago, was opposed to the prospect of using the U.S. military to invade Venezuela. I mean, more recent polling about the raid last weekend found I think only 33% supported it. So that was in comparison to the invasion of Panama that ousted Noriega, that at the time had something like 80%. You know, that's like the parallel that's being drawn here. So I mean, it's really not popular. I think it's going to backfire and hurt the Republicans, and I think that's why they're going to move on quickly and are just trying to find some quick accommodation with the government that's basically the same exact one that existed 2 weeks ago or a week ago.
Great.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess how or if will this change the sentiment of Venezuelans when it comes to their own government or how they think about building their political future? Because like the optic of a bunch of oil executives crowding around a map with the president and members of the Venezuelan government, like it feels, I could imagine, reminiscent of the colonial era. And, lots of parts of Latin America obviously experienced colonialism under the Spanish or the Americans. And, there is a long history of anti-colonial sentiment. And it, to me, sitting from the metropole of the empire or whatever, it does feel kind of obvious that this is, changing the government policy at the butt of a gun to benefit Americans more than Venezuelans primarily. Is that how Venezuelans see it? I mean, I know that there was a significant amount of discontent with the Maduro regime, but how will this be received by the Venezuelan populace?
I think it's going to be bittersweet. And I think you also have to sort of make a comparison between Venezuelans in the diaspora and also Venezuelans at home. So, I mean, I don't want to underestimate the amount of support that Maduro or the Chavista project retains, even if it's not as ideological of a project as it was and has sort of strayed quite substantially from its origins, right, as sort of like an anti-imperialist or socialist or sort of defiant project, right? I mean, there's still maybe 25% of people within Venezuela, mostly poor and working class Afro-Venezuelans, overwhelmingly, who are the ones that support the Bolivarian project writ large, right? So those are the people that are most impacted by sanctions. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't also hurt business interests and people in the diaspora in different ways. But I do think you're right that Venezuelans likely feel that they're being boxed out of this scenario. Whether they're supportive of Maria Corina Machado, and she has some pretty controversial views on foreign policy, toward Israel, toward the oil industry of like mass privatization. I mean, that's not very popular across the board. As I said earlier, like, I mean, the oil industry was nationalized and the Constitution protects Venezuela's sort of oil resources as belonging to Venezuelans, right? That's something that happened before, Chavez was elected. That was, at least almost 50 years ago.
Interesting. Wow.
So I would say that, like, and even on the issue of this territory that's contested with the neighboring country of Guyana. You might be familiar with the Essequibo. That's something that was a big sort of news story last year. There's a flare-up. Like, will Venezuela take over or invade the Essequibo?
Right. Oh my gosh, I almost forgot about that.
And the U.S. was really supportive and continues to be very supportive of Guyana and its defense of its sort of claim to that territory. But this is something that across ideology, irrespective of where you stand towards Maduro, Venezuelans believe that the Essequibo is Venezuelan. So that's like a point of similarity between the Chavistas and Maria Corina Machado. So there's certain sort of like nationalist issues that transcend ideology. But I do think that, even if the Venezuelan people probably are not too upset that Maduro has been gone, maybe, the means that it happened they find problem with, rightfully so. But even if they're happy that he's gone, that there might be some transition in the future, I do feel that they seem to be boxed out of the broader process of national reconciliation, of reconstruction, of some sort of power sharing agreement, or just sort of a broader attempt to incorporate the different plural political forces in civil society into some sort of resolution that will also benefit, longer term reconstruction and the oil interests that Trump wants. I mean, if that's what you're thinking about, sort of like investor confidence and, like getting the oil for our friends in the oil, they also want stability. They don't want a tweet to change the foreign policy from one day to the next. They don't want
I think it's called a truth.
Yeah, truth. Sorry. Truth. Yeah. The Truth Social post. They don't want this uncertainty about is Machado our woman? Is Delcy our woman? They want both to be ideally working together, or at least agreeing to not be calling for invasion of the other person, or to have gun bullet diplomacy over the head of the other person. So I think it's in the best interest of the Venezuelan people, of also U.S. strategic interests, and also just for broader regional peace and stability, for there to be an agreement, a reconciliation between all political forces, which has been largely left off the table by the Trump administration. And I don't want to be overly confident that Rubio's third phase of a transition will include something like that, because my understanding is his vision of a transition is basically give up power now and hand it over to Machado, which okay, yeah, there were elections. It's pretty clear that she won. Okay, that's fine. But also U.S. intelligence has assessed that basically she can't stabilize and govern the country. They can't do it. And so I think the proposals that we're seeing by countries like Mexico, like Colombia, by different agencies of the UN, of the Vatican, to have and that I think the Biden administration tried and maybe didn't implement as well as it could have, but to have some sort of broader resolution, some broader agreement, set of negotiations where we can start to sort of see a slow rebuilding of the institutions of the country that include all Venezuelans of all political persuasions, and that sort of democratically resolves the decades-long issues that have been in the country.
And do you see any signals that such reconciliation is on the horizon?
Well, again, I mean, I think the Trump administration is pretty fickle. I mean, it changes. It's not very clear what the end goal is. It hasn't made that clear to Congress. So, I mean, it's hard to predict. I would hope that that's something that, because of pressure from, different constituencies within Venezuela, from different U.S. allies, from international organizations, would be something that could be on the table after there is some sort of broader stabilization and recovery. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem right now that seems to be the priority. And again, above and beyond concerns about human rights, democracy, political parties, I mean, that's one framing, but I just mean more broader use of diplomatic tools, dialogue between disparate forces to assure that there's not another second wave of attack, or that a gun isn't being held to the head of the decision makers, whoever's in power in Caracas, if they don't accede to U.S. demands. I mean, that's basically what I'm talking about. And it might seem far off, but I think that's sort of the horizon that we need to be working towards.
We would have a hopeful horizon for Venezuela, but I think that this seems like there's a lot of potential negative externalities that could take us in other directions. And speaking of which, I wanted to bring up something close to your expertise. I've seen various officials in the administration, senators like Ted Cruz, think tank officials who have turned a lot of attention after this, decapitation of the Venezuelan leadership to Cuba. Talking about Ted Cruz said on Fox News this morning that the Cuban regime is closer to falling than ever before. And I think, Cuba plays a very interesting role in U.S. domestic politics, right? Is Cuba playing that rhetorical role again, where it's just sort of a punching bag, or is there actually some consideration with the U.S. government of moving beyond the continuing blockade, decades-long blockade of Cuba, towards actually taking some sort of kinetic or military action to try and change the character of the government there?
I think that the U.S. is definitely setting its sight on Cuba, as well as on Mexico and on Colombia, after its brazen sort of raid on Venezuela and bombing campaign. That said, I think there are a number of key considerations that will likely place constraints on the administration taking further action regarding Cuba. I mean, President Trump had an interview yesterday where he was asked about Cuba, and he actually deflected twice, and he turned the question around to the interviewer and said, "What do you think about Marco Rubio? Is he doing a good job?" as if Trump himself, he said, "Rubio, he has some Cuban blood in him, doesn't he? What do you think? Is he doing a good job?" And then also Trump said, well, people have been saying for the past 25 years or longer that Cuba's ready to fall, and it hasn't fallen. And again, maybe this is wishful thinking that, like, you know, Trump is not as interested in Cuba because, you know, there's no economic windfall to be gained because it has very few natural resources. There's no sort of soft line or compliant faction within the Cuban government that they've been able to identify, like they were identified with Delcy Rodriguez, who will be coerced and will be maybe manipulated to sort of comply with the U.S.'s maximalist demands. Maybe they're also just considering that because it's so much closer to the United States, just 90 miles away, and there have been multiple mass migration events from Cuba over the past 60 years that have really been difficult for past presidents, particularly Jimmy Carter in 1980 with the Mariel boat lift, to deal with, and have had electoral implications. They might be calculating, like, you know, the benefit might not be there for taking sort of kinetic military action in Cuba like they did in Venezuela. That's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned. I mean, he also said in that interview, basically, we've put on so much pressure, there's nothing else you can do except going in there and blowing the hell out of the place. I mean, that's scary, right? If you're in Cuba, but also for anybody who cares or studies, you know, Latin America or lives in Latin America, is Latin American. I mean, that he can just say that about any country should be a cause for concern. Though I do think those constraints are important. And, you know, I don't want to bring up now convicted Senator Bob Menendez.
Please do. Friend of the pod.
Generally, after the July 11th protests of 2021, you might remember in the midst of COVID, I was actually in Cuba at the time. There were, you know, thousands of people on the streets. Some were calling for the end of the regime. Most people were just fed up with the lack of electricity and the blackouts and the medicine shortages and the limited food options. But sort of it reached a tipping point and it spilled out into the streets. I think it was that day or the day after, amid calls from Republican elected officials in Miami to invade Cuba or for airstrikes. You know, I'm sure you guys remember, Menendez got up, I think it was on the Senate floor, or maybe to a reporter, and he said, "Let me just be clear. There will not be an invasion of Cuba. There will be not." You know, and I didn't want to have to bring this up, you know, because he is like the hard line of the hardliner. You know, like he and Rubio have worked hand in hand for decades on putting maximum pressure and sort of codifying into law these sanctions against Cuba. And he's also been somebody who's really sought for a more muscular U.S. foreign policy towards Venezuela to lead to the overthrowing of that regime. I don't want to invoke his name, but when you have somebody like Bob Menendez saying, like, that is a red line, like, we will not invade in Cuba, then I think that needs to be brought up in moments like today when you have people like Carlos Jimenez or Maria Elvira Salazar, other Rubio allies in Congress, who are making very strong insinuations that that's what the president should do. Well, if they're so close to falling, then just take that next little step and we'll take over the country. But I think I invoke Menendez for another really important historical reason, and it's the Bay of Pigs invasion. And that was a massive failure. And John F. Kennedy said that was one of the biggest regrets that he had of his administration. And the Cuban exile sentiment in South Florida and in New Jersey was basically of betrayal. They felt that the United States government did not back them up sufficiently. They wanted the U.S. to go even further and to not bail out on them. And that sense of betrayal, I think, has really had a lasting impact also on the national security establishment in the United States, of like, we are not going to do the bidding for you. If you want to go liberate Cuba, even though the United States has like provided, as I've said, millions of dollars in this regime change industry to support, these exile organizations, even if it has a codified embargo, blockade, whatever you want to call it, even as it ramps up sanctions, and all these are illegal and inhumane and should be lifted, like Cuba is the United States' southern flank. Like it is like an actual natural barrier for all of these forces that Trump wants to keep out, whether it's narco trafficking, whether it's illicit migration. And the Cubans actually, cooperate and are wanting to have more cooperation with the United States, with the Coast Guard, to prevent these sort of forces, from coming into the country. And like, I've talked to a lot of former intelligence officials, like who've worked in the U.S. government, who've worked on Cuba at high levels, and basically the consensus established position is that like it's not in the U.S. interest to have a failed state, to have an absolute fiasco in a country like Cuba, which could become sort of like the staging ground for any sort of mafia or organized criminal control, which doesn't exist in the country now. If there's some power vacuum, there's some void.
Interesting.
And it's just too geostrategically complicated and close for it to make sense to like do the bidding of the South Florida exiles, to like have vengeance for not fully backing them up in the Bay of Pigs. It's like they're not going to relive that episode of history because it's just not national interest. So I think there's like a red line there that even like the highest levels of the U.S. government understand. I'm not saying that I wouldn't put it past this.
I was like,
that's Trump. But like, I think there's important historical precedents and limits that might constrain them.
I didn't know you were friends with Menendez, and I would like that on the record. Lee is friends with Bob Menendez.
You have to at least give us a couple gold bars, and we're good. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting idea that like Alan Dulles was like the last person who took the exact opposite lesson about like needing to go harder. I mean, I would hope that would be true. I mean, I do think that there are a lot of places where the intelligence community is like more realistic about the prospects of blowback than the actual political community is.
That's not a good sign. Yeah.
No, it's not a good sign. That's not a good setup.
It's interesting. We just went from like, we kind of started this conversation talking about ideology, history. We went to oil, material, and then back to ideology. So I think it strikes me like that this conversation about Venezuela does come back to these Cold War sentiments that still haunt us today. I would call it a new Cold War, but it feels a lot like an old Cold War, and also a hot war, which isn't good. So I guess like I highlight this only because ideology or, the horrific facts of taking another country's oil are often part and parcel. And yet when we talk about something like Cuba, we are talking about kind of ideological warfares again. And I guess it strikes me because yet again, it's just something that has nothing to do with U.S. interests, or very little to do with U.S. interests. It's a threat of ideas is still an idea. And yet we're like bombing for it. I think it makes more sense to me cynically to bomb for oil. And I'm not saying I agree with that. Obviously, that's horrific. But bombing against a vibe shift, not as obviously useful to the American people. Maybe that just highlights, again, how undemocratic this entire play has been over the last few weeks. I know the Venezuela stuff has been going on for years, but especially in the last days with the kidnapping of Maduro, it just highlights just how out of touch the Beltway is with the needs, desires, and realistic future of American people. And I always just like to end on like a really depressing note.
This is a question that we try and ask this to every guest. What are some reasons to you, or important reasons to you, that the U.S. is always at war, always launching interventions, and do you see any of those reflected in the decision to topple Maduro?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of what we've talked about already are some of the major reasons why the U.S. is always at war. I think natural resources are one major part of that. I think also dominance and hegemony are another part, especially when you talk about Latin America, this hemisphere. I think ideology has to do with it in some cases, maybe like a place like Cuba, and where you talk about the Cold War. But also, I've spent the past year on the Democratizing Foreign Policy team, so clearly there are undemocratic mechanisms and structures that are built into the construction of U.S. foreign policy, and that has sort of locked the United States in to a militarized approach to dealing with the world. So you talk about sort of the Pentagon budget and the role of arms manufacturers and defense contractors. I mean, also foreign influence, and I've reported on this extensively, particularly in the policy towards Cuba and to Venezuela, but in other countries as well, of lobbyists who are former officials or who are former, government officials of other countries as well, who have their own narrow set of interests, usually, supportive of different corporations or elites in those countries who don't necessarily have the best interests out for the vast majority of the people of those countries, who are able to wield their contacts, their access, their past expertise to be able to engineer outcomes that are most beneficial to them. And I think that that's a really big part of at least this administration's approach to the Western Hemisphere. I mean, you can talk about the Don Road Doctrine and dominance, and clearly this has been what the administration itself has said. But if you go into the mechanics of like particular policies towards particular countries, maybe not the ones that make the headlines all the time, like Venezuela or Mexico. We talk about Central America, talk about the Caribbean, talk about other countries in South America that are smaller. A lot of the particular policies towards sanctions, towards arms sales, regarding trade, regarding migration deals, a lot of it has to do with the foreign lobbying and the influence industry in Washington that is really unchecked and is becoming less and less regulated under this administration. And so, but it's bipartisan. It's been a bipartisan consensus for decades.
Yeah.
Like former U.S. officials will then go into lobbying positions and represent, the countries that they formerly were stationed in and the leaders of those countries, and that's going to mold the outcomes of U.S. policy towards those countries. So, it's a lot of factors, but I think for Latin America, that's another sort of untold story of the foreign influence that's becoming increasingly relevant and paying off very well for some of these people in a personalistic and transactional administration like the one that we have.
Cool. So if we could cut here, I'm just going to go cry. Just kidding. That was a great
we'll
answer,
have our sob
Lee.
session.
Unfortunately, that is 100% correct. So yet again, living on a high note. But the real high note, Lee, is that people can follow you. They can learn about you. They can read your pieces. Can you tell them where to find you?
Yeah, so I'm going to have an upcoming piece in foreign policy with our colleague Adam of the Middle East program. I also write pretty regularly for Responsible Statecraft, so you can go to Responsible Statecraft's website and search my name, Lee Schlenker, and find all my past writing. I'm on X. My name is Lee_Schlenker. That's about it for social media. But if you put a link maybe
for
in
now
this episode, for now, if you put a link in this episode, I can include some of my other recent pieces that I've had in The Guardian and Inkstick Media.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Lee. We'll have to have you back because I want to talk about the Dems' relationship to this. I have so many more questions.
Yeah, we didn't even get into the bipartisanship of this all, really.
When you mentioned that at the end, I went, God damn it. It's so we'll have to have you back.
Next episode.
I'm sure everyone will be hungry to hear from you. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lee.
Mr. President, does the U.S. running the country mean that U.S. troops will be on the ground? How will that work?
Well, they always say boots on the ground. So we're not afraid of boots on the ground if we have to have. We had boots on the ground last night at a very high level, actually. We're not afraid of it. We don't mind saying it. But we're going to make sure that country is run properly. We're not doing this in vain. This is a very dangerous attack.
That was a great conversation, Alex.
The
Thoughts?
best.
Prayers?
That rocked. I mean, we're going to have a lot more conversation about this as this situation plays out.
Agree. Because I have more questions than ever, although I'm pretty happy with that conversation. I'm walking away both more informed and also more depressed, which is a classic takeaway of the Always at War.
I was going to say
the Always
that's
at War phenomenon.
That's the Always at War promise, like a graph of like intelligence going up, like satisfaction with being alive, and 2026 going down. Yeah.
Well, that is the end of our episode. We're so thankful for you listening. We need you to leave a 5-star review or any review, but preferably 5 stars. We need you to subscribe to the Quincy Institute YouTube channel at Quincy INST. We need you to subscribe to our TikTok and like our stuff on Twitter. Why do we need this? Because without your support, we will not be able to continue the show. And I want to continue the show, and you want us to continue the show, so you can get that Lexapro prescription re-upped. And how better to do it than listening to Always at War? So do that. Anything else, Alex?
Yeah, stay up to date on your fluoxetine. I know we will. Peace out, folks.
Peace. Thanks for listening.